Inspiration is a strange thing. Often, when we go searching for it, we come up short, almost like trying to find the end of the rainbow or capture your shadow. Yet, if you put yourself in normal situations and approach them with an open mind, you might find yourself stumbling upon more inspiration than you are prepared to use. I just got back from visiting family in Ohio. I spent time there wandering around on the shores of Lake Erie, partly because it's really pretty and mostly because an introvert cannot handle being cooped up in the same place with a dozen people for more than about a day without starting to go crazy. So I wandered. Sometimes I did so with music or while listening to a podcast, and sometimes I simply walked, alone with my own thoughts. In these little voyages, I stumbled upon many interesting things. There are old homes there in Lakeside, some built over 100 years ago, some refashioned or refurbished since then, and some bearing all of the same scars and marks that they would have from being that old. There are little fairy gardens outside many of the homes, different kinds of plants that I don't run into here in Colorado because, hey, things actually grow in Ohio because they have water. There are ships upon the Great Lake, great shipping vessels that come in from, presumably, the other Great Lakes or even from Canada. But what really grabbed me this time was the trees. Here in Colorado, trees often struggle to grow. Only in our mountains or in river valleys do they reach their full size. But in Ohio, where it rains more than it doesn't, trees reach great heights. I am aware that I live in a desert, but when I run into great trees and trumpet vines that have climbed 100 feet into the air, it always amazes me. But these trees, I simply walked around in awe of them. I took a ton of photos as my mind raced. What if elves lived in this one? Could I use this shot of the roots for a drawing? Simply being outside, walking around with no distractions, I found myself distracted by the things that matter, by the world around me. So that is the focus of this podcast this week. The inspiration from the random things around us, how important it is, and perhaps how we can put ourselves in a position to do so, to notice those things. Now, if you have been with me for much time at all, you probably know that I talk about getting outside and the importance that that has for us as artists. But I think I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle. In this particular situation, the reason I was able to take these things in is because I had no distractions, and the world itself was allowed to be my distraction. Well, hello, my name is Zach, and I'm an artist and an art teacher. Welcome to the podcast. The first thing that I want to talk about and focus on today is allowing your mind to wander. If you are like me, you probably struggled in school growing up. You sat in the classroom paying attention as long as you possibly could to the teacher as they spoke about whatever probably interesting subject that they talked about. But inevitably, your mind started to go other places. Maybe you found yourself writing notes and then that connected to another idea, and a minute later, you're sketching something in the margins on the side of your paper. If I go back to any of the notebooks that I still have from college, the side margins are just exploding with illustrations of anime and manga things, and then whatever it was that we were talking about in class as well. It's something that is condemned here in the United States, at least for students, letting your mind wander, letting it unfocus and untether. We spend so much time talking about how we need to focus more, how we need to focus on a singular thing. I was just listening to Jazza, who's obviously a big YouTuber here on the platform, yesterday about his recent ADHD diagnosis. And his mother had saved all of his reports from, I think, kinder or first grade all the way up. And as he was going over them, all of these things that were critiques of his behavior in those classes was basically he wasn't focused enough. He wasn't attached to what was happening in class. He was too eager to finish. He was drawing too much. And it was funny. I was cracking up as I was listening to this because those might as well have been the reports that I got as a kid. I don't know if my mother saved them. We transferred schools so much and moved because my dad was in the military. So I don't know if I have access to those things. But I remember hearing that kind of feedback as a first grader, as a second grader. In fact, I was pulled out of school after second grade and homeschooled for a year. But my poor mother could only deal with that for a year before I went into private school for fourth grade. Then we moved across the country for 5th grade, and you can see kind of why those records would be a little bit hard to have. But we, as a group of artists and creatives, are primed in a lot of ways to let our minds wander. And yet, I feel like, at least here in the United States, that behavior, that tendency is quashed. It's something that's pushed to the side. It's seen as not fitting in with the rest of the world and the rest of the workforce. And so much of the focus here, at least for the last 50 years in education, has been to prepare people to work in factories, to prepare people to work in the workforce. There hasn't been a lot of prep for having a good life, being a good partner or spouse, having a fulfilling existence. That has not really been the purpose. The purpose of education has been to prepare people to work, to pay taxes, maybe to, put money into Social Security, but I don't think it's quite that conspiratorial. But there is a focus here on those things, and it's shifting a little bit. It's shifting because we're seeing what the long-term results of that look like. And I think because younger people have access to the internet now and are exposed to a wealth of knowledge as far as how other people in other places live. And if you travel outside of the United States at all, you have an understanding that the way we do things here is not the only way to do things, and therefore, potentially, is not the best way to do things. It's one of the things that was frustrating for me sometimes with my students, because so many of them had never left our country, and in fact, a lot of them had never even left Colorado. And it's really hard to have much perspective and context for the existence that you live in when you've never left your home. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit tangential here, but this is actually to the point about letting your mind wander. We have so many scenarios now where we're not allowed to let our minds wander. And if you are like me, where it's going to happen one way or another, there's a good chance that you have allocated that mind wandering into a particular portion of your life. This is what I mean. How often do you sit down and do something, like drive your car, or commute on a train, or ride your bike, or just go for a walk, or just sit in silence? How often do you do that? I ran into a ton of people in my educational experience where this idea was just anathema to their existence. The idea of sitting in silence alone with their own thoughts was uncomfortable. It was strange. I had a colleague who actually was working on meditation when he was teaching a physical education course for a while. And one of the first days of that class, he just had the students sit for 15 minutes and not talk and not do anything. Like no music, they just had to sit outside, or if the weather wasn't great, they had to sit inside. And he actually had a couple kids crack. They started to lose it. One of them started crying, another one was just like, nope, I can't do this, like I'm done, and got up and started pacing. The idea of sitting still, or just sitting with your own thoughts for a prolonged period of time, and to me, 15 minutes is not that long. It just made some of those kids distraught. They didn't know how to deal with it. And I think if you have a mind that wanders like mine, an imaginative, creative brain that likes to problem solve and chew on things and mess with things, then you probably have created mechanisms that allow your mind to tether itself to things. This might be kind of an ADHD thing. It might just be a general artist thing. But regardless, try putting yourself in situations where your mind can wander. When I was going on these walks, when I go on walks here at home, if I don't have something to listen to, then I'm looking for things to entertain me. I'm looking for things to distract me. Or my mind is wandering and I'm poring over ideas for storytelling or ideas for artwork. Sometimes maybe I'm mulling over a conversation that I had with a person that didn't go the way I wanted to, and I'm getting anxious and nervous about that. And I think that reason is often why artists and creatives in general will push against that tendency, will push against the silence and the sitting and being alone with your own thoughts. But I think it's really important for a lot of reasons. One, you come to understand yourself better. You know who you are if you sit there and you're just alone with your own thoughts. You also will give yourself the opportunity to chew on things that you wouldn't normally. And tertiarily, you will see things like the trees that I saw because you're in a position where you're able to do so. So I was looking at things that I wouldn't necessarily pour a lot of interest into, a lot of time into. And these things were really cool and beautiful. And of course, I immediately started thinking, well, I've got a city. I've actually got two cities in the fantasy novel that I'm working on. One is called Sunachi, one is called Hyoku. They are giant forests, essentially, and sprites dwell there. And the sprites in my story are kind of similar to elves, except that they're furry and they're a little bit shorter. They're like if elves and hobbits and like a werewolf like kind of met in the middle. And they're these really intriguing creatures, but they live in these gigantic forests. And the one forest is these large, sprawling trees that have, interconnected root systems, and like walking through the undergrowth would be very, very difficult. But the trees are very individualistic. They're knotted like giant oaks and Russian olives that like twist back and forth and things like that. And the other forest is like a cathedral where all of the trees are the same kind of tree and they grow perfectly vertical, and it's just this massive high forest, which is really, really different. The sprites kind of in the one can dwell on the forest floor, in the other, the forest floor is so far below the canopy, it's pitch black, it's home to these diabolical creatures. But my brain, seeing these trees and the intricate root structures that were just above the surface, is immediately in those stories. Like, can I take a picture of this? Can I use this as I'm trying to sketch out and draw what this place looks like? Where could I put little holes in this that creatures could dwell? How would I hang structures from the branches? And those things are only things that I was able to get to and to start thinking about because I put myself in a situation where I had the opportunity to just let my mind wander. So that's the first thing that I want to talk about, or I have talked about now, I guess, concerning inspiration in just the normal everyday things, is put yourself in situations where your mind has the ability to wander by limiting your distractions, by being in a situation that isn't quite your normal. Most of us, perhaps, like our routines. I sit in the basement and work on art and record things for a substantial portion of my week. But I've got this lovely world outside that I have to go get into. I ran into a giant turkey feather yesterday from a wild turkey that was maybe like 18 inches, 22 inches long. And right next to it was a giant bull snake that was moving through my property. And so, I love snakes. So it was such a fun thing to hop out and be able to see the little critter. The apple trees here are just starting to get to the point where the apples are edible. And so on the way home yesterday, after picking up my daughter from the grandparents' house, we pulled an apple off and she ate it on the drive home. And those kind of things are cool. You don't notice them if you're moving too fast, if you're not allowing yourself to be distracted. All right, the next thing here is putting yourself in situations where you can take in interesting and new things. I actually already hit on this a little bit, and this podcast is not particularly scripted. I'm allowing myself to ramble a bit, so there might be some overlap in things. So this is something that has to be intentionally done. Like I just mentioned a moment ago, I have my routines. I have the things that I do normally, the places that I go normally. And when things upset them, I have a tendency to get agitated. If I have an extra meeting today, it's like, dang, that is just in the middle of my day and now it's going to ruin that. Even though I know the meeting's probably going to be like half an hour long and it's only 10 minutes from home, it's going to consume an hour, but I'm already thinking about it and processing it. So I certainly like my routines. But going for walks is one of the biggest things here that I can do to just get out of my space. And we have lots of areas around here that are good for hiking and walking. There's lots of parks. Sometimes this is about going and driving somewhere different. On your way home from work, maybe don't take the exact same path that you always do. I often will just fall into the routine of driving the exact same way to and from places. Now, for me, this is okay, because I often drive without any music, without listening to anything, and I'm just thinking. Sometimes I'm thinking out loud, sometimes I'm in my head. But if you are listening to things, if the idea of driving in your car or going on your commute without any noise at all is just scary, then maybe just take a different route if you can, and see what new sights there are, what new things you can absorb. This might be going to a different grocery store, a different set of stores, a different little town for your vacation if you manage to go on vacations. All that it is putting yourself in new situations. Now, as I'm talking about this, though, it's occurring to me that if you play a bit of video games, maybe trying a different kind of video game would be really beneficial to you. I noticed that my artwork was largely influenced in the last couple years by the time that I've invested into the recent Zelda games and into Elden Ring. Ironically, the vast majority of my video game time in the last like 4 years has all been Monster Hunter, but that hasn't really influenced my art too much. Maybe the creatures, the creatures are a huge focus, but there's not a lot in the way of like background storytelling there. Whereas in Zelda, in Tears of the Kingdom, and in Breath of the Wild, there's so much stuff happening in the background. So it's influencing me art-wise, but I'm also thinking about it from world building stances and from storytelling stances as well. Elden Ring obviously has a lot of that kind of stuff too, being that it's coming from the Dark Souls genre. And so there's layers upon layers of civilizations inside of there. And the way that all the creatures and the bosses and the characters are represented, they're all kind of falling apart and decrepit in some way, which has really meshed well with my love of drawing ugly things and painting ugly things, things that are falling apart, that have all these extra textures to them. And a lot of the dragons that I'm working on for Smogist right now are kind of that same way. They've got, like, very few of them are pristine things. I like messy. I like that grossness. And I think it started as a, like, oh, this is easier because there's lots of things that I can latch onto. There's lots of texture to play with. And the older I get, the more it's like, like there's wisdom and there's age and there's knowledge in all of those cracks and all of those little wrinkles on that creature's hide, because I'm getting older too. I don't have a ton of wrinkles yet, but they're coming. As the hair on my beard is graying, my wrinkles are increasing. So trying to put yourself in a situation specifically where you're going to run into new and interesting things can be really beneficial to just extracting inspiration from your normal everyday world. The next is kind of like the first two, which is getting out of your comfort zone. So I talked about trying a new type of video game, but maybe try a different type of art. I've talked a lot on this channel about whatever your normal is. If you draw with ink all the time like I do, I would strongly encourage you to look at watercolor, particularly because it meshes really well with ink, but also because it's very, very different in how it goes down. The nice part is that if you finish a watercolor painting and don't like where some of the things went, once it's totally dry, you can go over it with ink. So it meshes really, really well. But I think that's the first angle I'm going to take with this about getting out of your comfort zone, is trying different media. Sometimes you'd be surprised how different media will inspire you and move you in different ways. Ink is very precise. I really, really like it for that reason. But I find that when I paint, that the paint has a mind of its own. And it's part of the reason why I've struggled with digital art over the years, is digital art is so precise. It's an engine that does everything that we want it to. I know that there are programs that will emulate kind of the traditional way of doing things, but I haven't personally found one yet that feels right. And maybe I never will. Maybe I'll always be primarily a traditional artist in that capacity. But paint doesn't listen. If you're working with a dip pen with traditional ink, it doesn't always listen. It has a mind of its own in some way. And that can be frustrating. It can be frustrating that when you move your brush, it doesn't move exactly how you want it to. It can be frustrating to get the perfect green that you want. But the other side of that is that sometimes those mistakes, when your water runs, when the brush flares, when the color's not perfect, those things give you additional things to mess with. It's a lot of things because I'm not using, a varied enough vocabulary here. But those little discrepancies, those mistakes, give you things that you can manipulate, that you can change, that you can play with. I've had a lot of times of putting a mark onto a painting and stepping back and going, well, that sucks. That makes the whole painting work, less favorably. But then as you start to manipulate it, either that mark disappears entirely underneath something else, or only fragments of it are showing up. Watercolor, acrylic, and oil paint all have these aspects, these little hits of inspiration that can come from mistakes that you made earlier. Painting is a very different medium in a lot of ways to drawing. I do mostly drawing on this channel, primarily, honestly, because that seems to be what people jive with the most, which means at some point I might start a painting channel specifically. If you'd like to see that, let me know in the comments below. I have the channel already reserved, actually. It's just I haven't gone that way because most of my time and energy has been going here. I, at some point, would probably like to keep this channel being mostly just discussions about art, and then potentially open a drawing and a painting channel separately that are on like how to do things with that. Because as this channel has grown, it's become much more about creative problem solving and like the mental struggles that we have as artists. But I do have the vast majority of my professional experience grounded in actually educating people how to draw and how to paint. And so at some point I might do that. I would like to, but the amount of time that it would take is going to be pretty hefty at the beginning. So sorry about that little segue there, but I would strongly encourage you to get out of your comfort zone when it comes to your artistic media as a means of trying to drum up some extra inspiration. And the final reason with that is that you might not be doing the kind of art that you need to be doing. I'm not often a person who really believes in fate, but it does seem to me that most artists have a singular medium that is their main medium, or several, but most seem to have one or two. And you can be a person who really loves creating things, who is very creative and imaginative and loves making art, and maybe you've only drawn your whole life, or maybe you've only painted, and you work with these things and you love it, but something always feels like it's a little bit off. And then you try sculpture for the first time and it just clicks. And all of a sudden it's this realization that, oh my goodness, like I'm a sculptor. I had a student in mind right now that I'm thinking about that was very much this way, that this young woman had drawn and painted their whole life. And then they hit this point in like late middle school, high school, where they started doing some sculpture, and they and myself both had this realization that, oh, this is what you need to be doing artistically. Like this is what really works for you. You think three-dimensionally, you think constructively. I don't think that way. You know, sculpture and three-dimensional work is often a struggle for me. I do okay with metal and things that are more structurally sound that way, but clay and wax and carving are things that are really exciting to me, but not things that I'm particularly good at. And this student, after years and years and years of plugging away at drawing and painting with some like always underlying level of frustration, found their medium, and it was sculpture, it was clay. And I think for most of us, that thing exists. So again, I said I don't really believe in fate or like there's this ideal thing that you're going to run into, but my experience actually runs contrary to that. My experience has been that most artists that I've taught run into a medium at some point that clicks for them, regardless of what they've done before. And it's often not the thing that they've leaned on. Sometimes you do. You know, for me, I really enjoy ink, and it's something that I've come back to over the years. But for a lot of people, it's the opposite to whatever they have been working on, or it's the one thing they haven't tried. And maybe there's something weird psychologically there happening. I don't know, but it's an interesting thing. So try some different media. It might just be the thing to inspire you and kick you down the road a little bit further. But also with your comfort zone, try traveling, try different video games, try different TV shows, try different books, try surrounding yourself with some different kinds of artists. Try doing different things. Just work your way out of whatever your routine is artistically. Make sure that you keep yourself safe. I'm not saying that you should uproot yourself and move to a different city that you don't know anything about. Not that extreme, really. It's a matter of just whatever your normal is, identify it, and then move just a little bit outside of it. For me, a lot of that was putting my work online, was talking while I'm working. It's much more comfortable for me to make a video like this, where I'm just kind of rambling or reading a script as artwork's happening in the background. But when I do sessions where I'm working live and I'm just recording as I'm talking, that's much, much harder. And that's something that's a little bit out of my comfort zone. I'm actually going to start doing more of those videos here. I'd love to do live streaming if I could figure out a time in the week where I could definitely do it every week. But that's something that's a little bit out of my comfort zone, and that is exciting. I find that I talk differently about things when I'm working in that manner. But I think perhaps the most important thing is somewhere between keeping an open mind and allowing yourself to just be excited about things. This is hard because both of those are difficult things to do just by themselves on a very surface level. Like, how do you force yourself to have an open mind? It seems like generally you have to run into some tough times in your life or something that you mess up that forces you to have a more open mind. You offend somebody because you said something that was discriminatory and you didn't know it in the moment, and now you have that embarrassment and that awkwardness to deal with, and you can move forward. How do you force yourself to be more excited about things? Well, I'm not 100% sure, but I know that being aware of those things and focusing on them is perhaps one of the only ways that you can start to manipulate that and make it better for yourself. I can, I guess, at least talk a little bit about how I've done it, or how I've talked to other people and students in the past about it. Trying to keep an open mind artistically is really more about not wedging yourself into a box and into an idea of what you think you are as an artist, or what an artist is. Artists are weird, and trying to confine us to any definition is always going to be very difficult, and yet, as humans, we like doing that. We like putting things in boxes. It makes us feel safer. And this is something that we've done since the dawn of time. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that if you're aware of, you can start working against it. This might be as simple as when you say, I do this because of this. I do this because I'm a perfectionist. Well, are you? Or have you just told yourself that over the years? Have other people told you that? Do you really just have perfectionistic tendencies? When someone asks you why you don't paint, do you tell them, oh, I can't paint, I'm not a painter? Is that true? Or is that just what you've told yourself? So be careful not to confine yourself to a singular arena, a singular thing, when you don't need to. And the reality is, most of the time, we don't need to at all. We don't need to force those terms and those things upon ourselves. But the other side of that is the excitement. And how do you allow yourself or force yourself to be more excited about things? I find that, for me at least, disabling distractions helps. Putting myself in situations where basically I'm forced to just look at the things around me. In video games, this is not using guides and not rushing towards bosses or finishing the game. It's just stumbling around and figuring things out. When it comes to reading books, it's taking less pride in the finishing of a book and bragging about how many books I read in a particular amount of time, and just sitting there and going, I wonder why the author chose these words. I wonder why he cared about this particular thing. I'm a huge fan of Tolkien, and you can do this endlessly with his work. You can sit down and be like, why did this watchtower matter? Why does this hill matter? Why does this sword matter? And if you're not rushing through it, if you're allowing yourself to sit in that moment, you can be excited about the tiny little things. If you're going for a walk, or you're going for a bike ride, something that is exercise, the purpose of it is probably to burn calories and to stay healthy. But if you can allow yourself to appreciate that you're riding through or walking through the world, having the chance to see all kinds of other things, different kinds of people, then you can allow yourself to be excited about all those differences. If you're at the airport, where pretty much nobody likes to be, you can be frustrated about the fact that you're there, or you can be people watching and looking at all these interesting things that are happening around you. I don't have a perfect solution for how to keep your mind open, for how to remain excited about things. But whatever you can do on that front is going to help you find inspiration in the world around you. Because this world is amazing. When you open on Instagram and you see funny things and cat videos and beautiful art, those are all really cool things that are a part of our world. And the people that made those were inspired by the world around us. And we have that ability too. It exists for all of us. So I implore you to take some time in the world, on your drive, on your walk, whatever you're doing, and slow down a little bit. Try to take in extra detail. Try to look and see what kind of animals are around you, what kind of buildings are around you, how old are they, the cars that people drive, and maybe try to notice the trees. Well, as always, thank you for your time. I really appreciate you listening here. I love hearing from you in the comments. If you're looking to join an artistic community, we have a Discord server attached to this channel. Thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When for your continued support, and my other patrons as well. On our Patreon, if you would like to support me there, that would be amazing. On the Patreon, we have access to scripts and outlines ahead of time, as well as the ability to vote on things as far as what I do coming down the pipeline. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.